The R73 missile is Russia's current short-range air-to-air missile, and unlike a lot of their arsenal, it actually lived up to the hype, both in stats and effectiveness on the battlefield. It would inspire a wave of frantic development programs in NATO, and would define the future of short-range air missiles for everyone that wasn't British. So how did the Soviets start and the Russians finish what was possibly the best air-to-air missile of its day? Like most things in communism, it started with stealing what your richer neighbour was using. It's the 1950s and America and the UN are fighting for the future of a not-so-free, not particularly democratic South Korea. The earliest conflict of the Cold War was basically World War II with jets, but the conflict would start to create new alliances in Asia. One of the observations of the war was that air-to-air missiles mounted to jets would be quite effective, so all of the major powers would get to work. Russia put less effort into its early programs, and in response they wouldn't really go anywhere. But America loves air power, so their development of what would become the AIM-9 would progress quickly. They had a new wonder weapon that could take out any Soviet fighter, and would begin selling these new missiles to their allies in Asia in an attempt to limit the rise of this China. They would sell AIM-9s to the other China, and in 1958 one would get used and fail to do its job, lodging in the side of a Chinese MiG. It wasn't a great look. The Soviets would realise that their complacency had given the dirty capitalists an edge, and so became inspired to create an entirely new, definitely not copied competitor to the AIM-9 called the K-13. Later the name would change to the R3 and it would undergo improvements to the warhead, motor and the manoeuvrability, but it still had all of the flaws that early heat-seeking missiles would have. It's now the late 1970s, and as copying the American technology had reached a dead end, the Soviets thought they would try again at the whole, developing their own approach. After 5 years they came to the development of the R60. It was faster and more manoeuvrable than the R3, but it wasn't the technical leap the Soviets had wanted. It was definitely better, but its small warhead meant that some NATO aircraft could survive hits. It was also a rear aspect of missile only. The high manoeuvrability helped alleviate this, but it really wasn't what they wanted. As good enough clearly wasn't good enough, the Soviets went back to the drawing board. The two things they wanted to change most were the targeting and launching method, along with the ability to target aircraft from any angle, so they set to work. For anybody tracking the NATO equivalent for this point, it's the AIM-9L, an all-aspect missile. It was vastly superior to the R60 and everybody knew it. Unfortunately for the Soviets, the Americans had fixed the whole not exploding problem, so the chances they could steal one were quite low. Development of the Seeker came quickly and in a similar way to everybody else, but what was truly groundbreaking was how they were targeted. The Soviets were the first to create a helmet-mounted sight, allowing the aircraft to point in one direction as the missile fired in another. This doesn't sound that important, but it was akin to the dreadnought in a doctrinal change. The 1980s were a great decade for the Soviet Union, and citizens could sleep happy knowing that they had eclipsed NATO and the future was certainly bright. Until it wasn't. It turns out that an air-to-air missile cannot make up for a lackluster economy. With the collapse of the Union, some of the former communist bloc moved closer to NATO, and the unification of Germany is the part that we're interested right now. The now Russians had stationed large stockpiles of the R73 in East Germany, which now fell into the hands of the dirty Americans, who were in fact surprised they had been surpassed. The discovery would lead to the creation of NATO's short-range missile program, which promptly fell apart, leading to the development of the Irish-T and the ASRAAM, which I have done a video on here. These programs were taken till the early 2000s to see widespread use, but it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for Russia. To put it mildly, they were broke. They could hardly keep factories open, so continued development would stall from 1991 until 2003. They would improve it, renaming the missile to the R74, but in truth it wasn't really an improvement. They switched a number of the internal components so they could be procured from Western and Chinese sources, as when former Soviet chip manufacturers closed their doors they could no longer produce the missile. A true modernization program wouldn't come until the early 2010s, with the development of the R74M2. Improvements to the Seeker and a full digitization of avionics allows for a better discrimination between aircraft and flares, and whilst it's not a direct competitor to the modern ASRAAMs, AIM-9Xs or RSTs, it is clearly good enough for many users. This list of users is somewhat extensive, and that's if we don't include China in its international sales, who developed their own PL-10 in 2010. With Russia being a dominant player in the global arms industry, and its opposition to USA and NATO leaving it as the only option for a lot of countries, their place isn't that surprising. The missile is normally sold as part of a deal with countries that procure Russian fighter jets, mostly the MiG-29, but the missile is occasionally used by Su-series aircraft, normally the Su-27s. The only countries to use the missile in combat though is a much smaller list, so that's what I will focus on at the end of the video. As for the missile's stats, it comes in at a length of 2.93 meters and a diameter of 165 millimeters, increasing to 510 at the wingtips. This makes it nearly identical in size to the UK's ASRAAM. The total mass of the missile is 105 kilograms, with 7.4 kilograms being the warhead, making it both heavier than the ASRAAM with a smaller warhead. This is made up for the fact that it's both slower than the ASRAAM, coming in with a top speed of Mach 2.5, and it having an identical range. I am somewhat lost on how the Russians managed to achieve this, but there you go. You would hope that it would somehow be cheaper than its competitors, but at a price of around $200,000 a shot, no, it's the same cost. It is made in much larger numbers though, so maybe quantity has a quality all its own. Given its lackluster stats in the modern day, how has it actually performed? It was first used by the Cubans in 1996. The brave Cuban Air Force was able to successfully shoot down 2 fearsome Cessna 337 Skymasters. Onto actual combat. This would come in 1988 during the Eritrean-Ethiopian War. Both sides used the R73, and they would be very effective at engaging other Russian fighters. Then Russia would use them in 2008 to shoot down a Georgian UAV, so they can engage unmanned aircraft as well as Russian ones, but onto their use against NATO aircraft. And for this we go over to India and Pakistan in 2019. India have claimed to have shot down a Pakistani F-16. The evidence for this is shaky, there is no external confirmation from anyone. All I can tell you is that F-16s were in the airspace, I can tell you that Indians fired a missile at something, and I can tell you there was a radar screen that showed a dot appearing and disappearing. Do what you want with that information. And last, of course, is the Russia-Ukraine war, where it has seen some limited use. This owing to the reduced role of aircraft in the battle space and the fact that neither side can achieve air superiority, and where SAM sites are seemingly everywhere, this has all limited aircraft's use in a combat. But with most other air-to-air missiles, the idea of using the R73 as a ground-based system has been tried, mostly by forces that have no other choice. This trend started in Serbia during the Yugoslav wars, and continued into GWOT with both the Libyan National Army and the Houthis in Yemen using the R73 in the surface-to-air role. All 3 of these actors saw limited success with the tactic. Ukraine have also been employing this tactic with some unverifiable reports of Russia doing the same. These improvised systems all lack radar guidance for the missiles, making them somewhat unreliable. So what about the future of the R73? Russia is currently not developing a replacement, just continuing the upgrades and modernization efforts through the R74 program. But as the war in Ukraine continues to drag on and stockpiles of the missiles continue to dwindle, they will have to decide whether to make do with the older design, or if it's better incurring the cost of making something new.